You know him as the senior pastor of Willow Creek Community Church, founder of the Global Leadership Summit, author of more than 20 books, and most importantly, a leader committed to inspiring men and women to raise the stakes when it comes to leadership. Please welcome Bill Hybels.
Thank you, everybody. Now, the title of this opening talk is Hard-Fought Leadership Lessons, which suggests that certain kinds of leadership insights come easily, intuitively, and at very low expense, while another kind comes counterintuitively, kicking and screaming, and often at very high expense. It's that second kind that I want to offer for your consideration today. Here we go. We're going to start with a true or false. True or false? All leadership is intensely spiritual. All leadership is intensely spiritual. Now, I did not say that all leadership is religious. I said it is spiritual in the sense that every single decision you make as a leader has a direct effect on the emotions, the psyche, and the spirit of those you lead. Think back to the job you had in your younger years, when your supervisor didn't give a rip about you, simply ordered you to put your head down, shut your brain off, and do what you were told to do. You remember how that felt. You remember how that affected your spirit. I made what I thought was a helpful suggestion to a boss that I had in my teenage years. His response lingers in my mind 45 years later. Billy, I didn't hire you to think. I hired you to work. So shut up and work. So I worked. But while I worked, I kept on thinking. And not about how I could improve things on that job, but where else I was going to work someday. Because I knew in that moment my spirit could not survive under that kind of leadership, nor can yours. Let me take the mystery out of where I'm going with this. Leaders, by definition, we are visionaries. We can't help ourselves. We're gifted by God to see the future before other people see it. We leaders get seized by visions from God, and we begin painting pictures of the future that produce passion in other people. Before long, we're architecting strategies toward vision achievement. And then comes the adrenaline rush of progress toward vision achievement, changed lives, or better bottom lines. And often without us even realizing it, the vision begins to consume us. We eat it, we drink it, and we sleep it. It becomes our identity, it affirms our self-worth, and it adds sometimes some zeros to our net worth. But if we're not careful, the condition of our team slowly falls to secondary import as we as leaders become increasingly obsessed with the thrill of achieving the vision. Here's what I've observed over the last 20 years. Often, leaders with the highest level of vision and passion have the lowest level of awareness of the spirit of the team he or she assembled to achieve the vision. Can I say it again? Leaders with the highest level of vision and passion often have the lowest level of awareness of the spirit of the team he or she assembled to achieve that vision. Now, it never starts out that way. It's just that along the way, the leader feels so responsible for vision achievement, pays such a high price for it, and sacrifices so deeply for it, often to the point of utter exhaustion, that there comes that day when the leader senses that no one else on the team is as committed to the vision as she or he is. They're not working 80-hour weeks. They're not risking their life savings. They're not flying the red eyes and missing the children's ball games, which eventually translates to the leader that they just don't care about the vision as much as they should, which is crazy making to a leader. And once the leader begins to look at the team through the they don't care enough lens, a subtle disconnect occurs. And instead of the leader asking, maybe I care too much about vision achievement, the easier conclusion is reached. If they don't care about the vision as much as they should, I don't need to be as careful with their hearts as I used to be. There are other people out there that would care even more than these people care. And without ever really doing the math, the leader subconsciously decides that most of the people on the team are now expendable, or at least very interchangeable, which only deepens the detachment with the team. Now, to be very clear, none of this is ever discussed openly. Few people would even have the vocabulary to have this conversation. But everybody starts to sense it and sniff it and feel it. Everybody knows what's going on. Now, if you're wondering how someone as pedestrian as me could offer up such a penetrating insight, let me remind you of the risk that I took about 7 years ago when my human resource director talked me into having an outside firm conduct an employee engagement survey of the staff here at Willow. I mentioned this last year that I was hesitant to have this first survey done because we had just emerged from an era where several senior leaders had left and there was a little uncertainty in the air. But against my better judgment, we did the survey. When the results came, I took the packet home one night and I had dinner with my family, and then for a little pre-bedtime reading, I thought I would read the executive summary. Now, many of the comments that the staff made were positive. Some were actually thrilling, but far too many of them expressed a subtle kind of disconnectedness from our senior leadership. Some said they felt like cogs in a giant wheel, gears in a machine, but there was one written comment that cut me to the very core of my being. Now, to this day, I don't think it was meant to be hurtful to me or anybody else. The person simply wrote this: I love our church with all my heart, but I feel like a grunt, like a grunt. All of us in the U.S. know exactly what that term means, but before our translators have heart attacks, let me define what a grunt is. A grunt is someone who works long hours and feels invisible, unappreciated, and expendable. Grunts know that their opinions don't matter. They feel like I felt when my boss told me to stop thinking and just work. It's a terrible feeling. And someone on our church staff, someone on my team, felt like a grunt. And God used that sentence to pierce me to the core. Now, as a Christ follower, I know from what God's word teaches that what God treasures most in this world is people, even more than visions. People. And I had one of my people feeling like a grunt. I fell to my knees in the study that night. I vowed before God with tears coming down my cheeks, these things were going to change. The next day, I assembled my executive team. I read that very sentence to them, and I asked them if they would join me in my commitment to God that we would fix our culture. By God's grace, I didn't have to ask twice. They were as heartbroken as I was and equally determined to make things right. Over the last 7 years, we have dug in and paid the price to move to a place where we are as passionate as ever about the vision of our church and equally passionate about the spirit of the people who are giving their lives to the achievement of that vision. If you were to ask me today to list the most satisfying accomplishment of my last 20 years of leadership, near the very top would be the transforming of our culture. My only regret, and it's a deep one, is that it took me decades to understand the critical importance of all this. And so many people under my leadership paid such a heavy price for my dim-wittedness along the way. Leaders, I'm asking you to learn from my mistakes. Don't make your people pay because you're so fired up about the vision. Don't get so addicted to vision achievement that the people around you start feeling like equipment, expendable, replaceable, or God forbid, like grunts. And right now, if you already feel God tapping you on the shoulder saying, this is for you, Just agree with God and say, I'm listening, God. I'm listening. I'll keep my mind and my heart open. And if you're wondering what practical steps are required to turn a culture around, what practical steps are necessary to set the spirit of your team on fire in a good way, let me briefly mention 5 key commitments that we made that were enormously beneficial for us. The first commitment was to use an outside objective firm to run the engagement survey and help us interpret the results. We used an outfit called the Best Christian Workplace. Now, I suppose we could have put a survey together on our own and tried to figure it out all by ourselves. I'm very grateful, however, for our decision to use an outside firm with a lot of experience and proven methodology. They were able to benchmark our engagement levels against other organizations of our nature and size. It's been extremely helpful. The second key commitment we made was for me and my entire executive team to really own this turnaround. Had I simply delegated the culture challenge to the HR department, it would have been doomed from day one. I want to repeat a quote that I gave you last year. Your culture will only ever be as healthy as the senior leader wants it to be. Your culture will only ever be as healthy as the senior leader wants it to be. Senior pastors, CEOs, there's nowhere to hide. You can't hide from this truth. Only you can bring about the resolve necessary to transform a culture. When my executive team saw my determination, when our HR department felt my engagement and empowerment in this challenge, we were halfway home. We didn't know it at the time, but we were halfway home. It'll be the same with you. The third key commitment that we made was to get real serious about training everyone on our staff who manages people. Now, because people management came quite naturally to me, I naively thought anybody could manage people. I no longer hold that position. To the contrary, I now think it should be illegal to allow certain people to manage other people. Illegal. And anyone in our current culture who's entrusted with people management responsibilities is mandatorily required to receive rigorous ongoing training to get better at it. Here's another quote from last year that I want to drive home again this year. People join organizations, they leave managers. There's a lot of people who look at an organization that has a white-hot vision, a white-hot purpose, and they go, I want to join that great cause. And then they find out who their supervisor is. Some time ago, I met with a man who recently quit his job from the Salvation Army, of all places, one of the world's great organizations, lofty values, a God-honoring vision to serve the marginalized in society. Such a fantastic organization. I said, why did you leave the Salvation Army? He answered by saying that his direct supervisor was a cold, uncaring control freak who systematically sucked the joy out of his daily life. I could just hear that sucking sound while he was telling me about it. But he wound up his little comment to me saying that he quit for soul preservation purposes. Trust me when I say that you will never reach your culture's full vitality potential until every people manager in your organization leads and loves well. And that requires rigorous and ongoing training. The fourth key commitment we made was to raise the level of candor in our twice-a-year performance reviews. Gang, trust me on this. Every single worker that shows up at every job site anywhere on planet Earth and puts in a full day's work, every worker secretly wants to know at the end of the day, how am I doing? How am I doing? Do you notice my work? Am I making a contribution? Am I adding value in any way? In my new view, it is cruel and unusual punishment not to answer those questions regularly. Remember what Jack Welch said at the summit a few years ago? The kindest form of management is the truth. We recently added 3 words to our twice per year performance conversations. These 3 words: start, stop, continue. Michelle, you're doing great, but it's time for you to start looking for a number 2 person to build into. Your ministry's grown. You got to start building into a number 2 person. Michael, your people complain that your meetings are confusing, too long, and often boring. Michael, that's got to stop. Stop. You need to start maybe using the 3M approach that we talk about around Willow. Start the meeting by clarifying exactly what you're trying to move ahead. People got to know, what's this meeting about? What are we trying to move ahead? That's the first M. If you're trying to move something ahead and it isn't moving, then modify the plan. That's the second M. Change the conversation immediately to what has to be adjusted or tweaked to get the desired progress. Modify something. And Michael, never forget the third M, which is to motivate your people before the meeting ends. Don't let people leave any meeting without you thanking them and blessing them and inspiring them. One of your key roles, Michael, as a people manager, is to foster an environment of inspiration. So Michael, repeat after me, 3M, move something ahead, modify what isn't working, motivate the team before they leave your office. The mental image that I carry, every time I end a meeting in my office, I have lots of meetings in my office. The mental image I say is, I want to motivate and inspire people at the end of meetings so that they would levitate out of my office. So they just go, that was a fun meeting, and Bill believes in me, and I can't wait till the next meeting. So start, stop, and then that third word, continue. This is the time where we pour some praise out on our people. Lisa, continue calling the best out of your people, because often people won't give their best unless the leader challenges them to do so. And you're challenging people to give their best. So Lisa, you're doing great at that. Continue. Paul, your team knows that you treasure them. They feel valued and believed in. They would follow you anywhere. Way to go. Continue leading like that. Gang, with these 3 words, the main point is specificity. You want to find the ways or the words that enable you to be so clear in your performance conversations that team members know exactly what you're talking about, exactly how they can improve, and they're fired up to get better. You know the mantra, everybody wins when a leader gets better. We expect all of our people managers to be getting better. The 5th key commitment we made was the toughest to make and will be the toughest for us to keep. And that is a ruthless commitment to resolving relational conflict regardless of how scary it feels. John Paul Lederach is a reconciliation expert who teaches at Notre Dame University. His book, Reconcile, reframes how to look at relational conflict whenever, wherever it occurs in your life. What if, he asks, what if we all looked at conflict as the opportunity to strengthen a relationship, as opposed to viewing it as the precursor to relational ruin? Would that change the way we approach conflict resolution? Gang, that question from Lederach's book, Reconcile, doubled my courage to move toward people with whom I'm having relational conflict as opposed to moving away from them. Viewing a relational rift as the very real opportunity to come to new levels of understanding the other person and the very real possibility of establishing deeper levels of trust once we work through the conflict has been a game changer for me. And we're trying to build that understanding and value into our culture. Again, the title of Lederach's book is simply Reconcile. And with all the conflict in organizations, families, with all the conflict in our world these days, I wish half the world would read that book, Reconcile. So those are the 5 key commitments we made to turn our culture around. But before I move on to my next hard-fought leadership lesson, can I give you a couple of chilling statistics? In the average Christian organization, fasten your seatbelts, in the average Christian organization, only 54% of the employees are truly engaged in their work. 54%. Now, before you vomit, in the U.S. corporate world, according to the latest research from Gallup, only 30% of the employees in corporate United States are excited about their role and engaged in their work, 30%. Internationally, across businesses, the rate is half that. Now, those numbers made me feel just a little bit better when our latest engagement survey came back showing that 81% of our staff at Willow are highly engaged in their work. But I have to confess, it's still heartbreaking to me, and it's heartbreaking to my senior team, that 19% of our staff feel either under-challenged or disconnected from the exciting work that God's doing here at our church. Now, we might look okay by benchmark comparisons, but I won't be satisfied until 100% of our staff feel fired up about coming into work every day. Now, as silly as this sounds, I confess to you in advance, this sounds silly. Every single day as I drive on this campus, my heart rate increases a beat or two. I love what I get to do in my leadership role here at Willow. And this is after 39 years, and it still makes my heart rate increase. I love what I do, and I want that for every single member of our staff, that they'd say, oh, I get to work here today and move the purposes of God forward, and I know my role matters, and I know that I'm on a high-capacity, high-functioning team, all that kind of stuff. All right, enough on that. Let's move to my next hard-fought leadership lesson that I've learned over the last 20 years. This is another true or false. Some of you got the last one wrong, so you might want to play this one a little more carefully. Great leadership is, by definition, relentlessly developmental. Great leadership is, by definition, relentlessly developmental. Of course, this is absolutely true. No card-carrying leader would ever answer false to that question. Every true leader knows deep down they should turn in their leadership badge if they fail to develop emerging leaders. It's partially why God made us leaders, to prepare the next generation for key leadership roles. But where I see thick clouds of confusion all over the place these days is in the how. So many leaders I meet have secretly concluded nobody really knows how best to develop emerging leaders. It's vague, it's mysterious, it's probably cost prohibitive. So they quietly give up on leadership development, and they feel guilty every single day for doing so. Because in their spirit, they know they ought to be developing leaders. Recently, our senior leadership team spent a full day with Bob Eichinger. He's a leadership development guru. He's spent his entire adult life gaining clarity on what is the best way to develop leaders. Now, here's what he found in rank order. Among the 5 top ways to develop emerging leaders is to, 1, put them in high challenge roles. In other words, make their job a stretching, challenging job that will keep them developing and growing. 2, assign them to a short-term task force. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Offer them real-time feedback. That'll make them better. That'll develop them. Provide them with coaching and mentoring. It helps a ton. Statistics show it. And finally, at the bottom of the list, offer them classroom courses and seminars. Now, you're all wondering right now, why are you sitting in a classroom if it's 5th on the list of what best develops leaders? My answer to that is you're in the class to learn 4 better ways to develop leaders. And as I said earlier, the one that I want to put under the microscope for a few moments is number 2, assigning people to short-term task forces. Very few of us would ever buy a car without taking it for a test drive. Short-term task forces allow you to test drive an emerging leader's potential before you put them in a major leadership role. But according to Bob Eichinger, the test drive or task force assignment must meet the following 5 criteria. First, success or failure must both be possible. This has to be for real, this task force assignment. Second, the emerging leader must take full charge. They have to have full authority. Third, the emerging leader must work with a wide variety of people, hopefully all across the organization. Fourth, the task must involve real pressures and it must have a deadline. Fifth, the end product and performance must be evaluated by a senior leader. Now, please get this if you get nothing else about how leadership development really works. What you're really looking for when you're trying to develop tomorrow's leaders is how, big word now, is how resourceful they are. In many ways, resourcefulness is the most essential weapon in a leader's arsenal. Why? Because senior leaders in great big jobs in organizations around the world, they lead in such fluid and chaotic environments that they rarely know exactly what is the right thing to do. There's no formula. There's no roadmap for them to follow at their level. So they become experts in this thing called resourcefulness. I was asked in a magazine interview recently, what in my background most prepared me for senior leadership in a complex organization? That's easy, I replied. Having a dad whose mission in life was to force me to be resourceful. I cited the time I went snow skiing for the first time. I happened to mention it to my dad after dinner one night. A week later, he told me to pack my bags because he had arranged for me to have a ski adventure in Aspen, Colorado. Within hours, he put me on a train all alone in Kalamazoo, Michigan, bound for a 12,000-foot mountain in Colorado. I'd only ever skied once, and I was 11 years old, all alone on a train to Aspen. On the way to the train, I posed a few questions to my dad. Hey, Dad, where is Colorado? How will I know when I get there? How will I find the hotel? How will I get to the ski slope? I was just a little curious. He gave me the three-word answer, which encapsulated his entire leadership development plan for my life. Figure it out, Billy. Figure it out. Now, this was followed by his second favorite phrase, which later cost me about $50,000 in Christian counseling fees. Don't call me. Figure it out and don't call me. So when the train stopped 40 miles from Aspen, and I stepped off into the night with no one around, I had no clue how to get myself from there to the hotel in Aspen. So I figured it out. And when there was no way to get from the hotel the next morning to the ski slope, I figured it out. And when I'd only skied once and found myself atop a 12,000-foot mountain, I had to figure out how to ski down without killing myself. So I figured that out too. Mainly on my butt, trying to avoid trees, if you're wanting a ski lesson. For the next 10 years of my life, my dad put me in scores of challenging situations all over the world and simply said, figure it out and don't call me. Admittedly, his approach was too extreme, and it was not nurturing enough. But to this day, I put that in there just for all you psychologically astute people. Explains a lot who I am, I suppose. But to this day, I benefited from his mission to make me resourceful. Before you put any emerging leader into a senior leadership role, you simply must ascertain what they're going to do when they don't know what to do. Because in fact, they will rarely know what to do once they're in a great big job. So what are they going to do? Are they going to quit? Are they going to cry? Are they going to shut down? Are they going to fake it? Or will they dig in, dig down, and demonstrate determination, creativity, collaboration with others, and will they eventually figure it out? In today's complex world, no senior leader can possibly know enough right now to be equipped to handle what's going to be thrown at him or her within days of being entrusted with a great big role. So learning agility or resourcefulness is so important. Last year, due to a staff transition, I was looking for someone on my senior staff who might become my executive pastor. After several conversations, I narrowed my selection to a 38-year-old woman who was one of the finest people managers on our staff. In previous years, I had increased her scope of responsibility several times. She had exceeded my expectations every time. But around Willow, the executive pastor role is the next largest role other than my role, and I really wanted to get this appointment right. So I decided to offer this woman 2 critical task force tests to discern if she was ready for this role. The first was to put her in charge of the entire budgeting process all across Willow for 1 season. This involves both a lot of money and a lot of staff who have definite plans for how that money ought to be spent. And she figured that out, and there was no bloodshed. And then I had her complete the task of the construction of our care center, an $11.5 million project. She built a great team, solved 100 problems, got it done on time, under budget. She figured that out. And after doing a fantastic job in both those tests, I and all of her colleagues cheered her on when I appointed her as our next executive pastor. Senior leaders, the challenge comes now right in your face. When is the last time you've taken the time to assign an emerging leader to a pass-fail task force test to determine their resourcefulness? You have young leaders all around you. Some of them are so much better than you think they are. The reason you haven't put them in bigger roles is you think they're too young. Some of them have amazing resourcefulness, and at a quite young age, they could carry a quite senior role. How are you ever going to find that out? Flip coins? I make the strongest challenge and suggestion that you take the time to put together some of these task force tests, and you put young people in them and you see how resourceful they are. You evaluate them and then do what God leads you to do. Okay, let's move on. The third hard-fought leadership lesson. Third hard-fought leadership lesson. This is so recent in my thinking that I'm more than a little concerned about how to give voice to it. I've never taught about it. I've never written about it. Maybe the best way to unpack it is to cite a teaching of Jesus in the New Testament book of John chapter 10, where he makes a haunting comparison between 2 kinds of leaders. Now, to drive his point home in the culture he was communicating to, he cast these 2 different leaders as shepherds. He observes, he says, there's 2 types of shepherds out there. The first he calls hireling types. He says, here's what you need to understand about hireling types. If you're thinking about bringing one on your staff to watch over part of your flock, here's what you need to know about them. First, they don't give a rip about your sheep. They don't. They never will. Second, they have no intentions of staying long term. The first better job that comes along will be the last day they tend sheep for you. They're short-termers. Third thing you need to know about these hireling types is that if a predator threatens the well-being of the sheep, this hireling will be the first to run for safety. He will risk precisely nothing for the sake of your sheep because neither you nor they mean anything to him. On the other hand, Jesus said there's a totally different kind of leader out there. Again, he's talking in the metaphor of a shepherd. He says there's another kind of shepherd, they're owner types. This kind of shepherd, Jesus said, actually cares about the sheep. And they have a long-term view of caring about the sheep. And if a predator threatens the well-being of the sheep, if you can believe this or not, this kind of shepherd will literally lay down their life for the well-being of the sheep. Now, this was a masterful teaching from Jesus because he was both bearing witness to his true identity as the good shepherd who would willingly and lovingly lay down his life to atone for the wrongdoings of the whole world, and it was a warning to all the rest of us in leadership to learn the difference between hireling types and owner types. Mastering this discernment skill can save your organization a boatload of heartache. I guess what I'm really talking about in this third hard-fought leadership lesson is finding and developing leaders with a legacy mindset. Leaders with a legacy mindset. Did you know that just a few short decades ago, it was perfectly normal for emerging leaders to commit themselves to an organization's mission for 15 or 20 or even 30 years? Are you aware of the fact that right now the average tenure for a Fortune 500 CEO these days is 4.5 years? 4.5 years. This is of great concern to me. It should be for you as well. Today in church work and in faith-based charities, it is increasingly common to see hireling types, ladder climbing mindsets, short-termers creeping into our workforce. And this starts to keep me awake at night, I kid you not. Because I know and you know that prevailing churches, effective NGOs, quality businesses cannot be built on the shoulders of hirelings with short-term mindsets. They just don't care enough. They won't be around long enough. They won't sacrifice deeply enough to build something of enduring value. These days, as I add staff and give emerging leaders larger roles on our staff, I make no apologies in the interviewing process for asking the kinds of questions that will help me discern who is a hireling type, who's a short-term ladder climber, and who's more of the owner type, who wants to dig in and make a legacy play. Legacy leaders are the only ones willing to pay the price to really fix a broken culture because they're going to live in it and they're going to love the people. Legacy leaders are the only one who will ride out rough patches. And all organizations have rough patches. Legacy leaders are the only ones willing to address the long-term economic viability of the organization or to get real serious about leadership development because they are working for what I call the grander vision. They're working for the grander vision. Now, hireling types, ladder climbers, short-termers, are often fueled by personal ambition, self-advancement, self-aggrandizement. Legacy leaders run on a higher quality fuel source. Often it's to please the God they love, but sometimes it's as altruistic as simply wanting to give their one and only life to a cause beyond themselves. Either way, legacy leaders are the one who leaves something beautiful behind when their hourglass is empty. Now, our world lost a one-of-a-kind legacy leader since we last gathered, Nelson Mandela. For a quarter of a century, he was imprisoned on an island off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. During that time, as you all well know, he was humiliated, beaten, and worked nearly to death for his crime of wanting to end apartheid in the country he loved. When he was finally released from prison in 1990, he had every right to declare that his final years were going to be spent licking his wounds and hating his white oppressors until his final breath. Instead, he committed himself to a grander vision, that of running for high office in order to end apartheid and unify South Africa. Nelson Mandela left a breathtaking legacy, and history will never forget him. Since we last gathered, I met another legacy leader, but in a most unusual place, a maximum security prison. Burl Cain became the chief warden of Louisiana State Penitentiary the same year we started the Global Summit, 1995. He knew what he was getting into. He accepted the challenge of overseeing the largest, bloodiest, most violent prison in the United States. 6,000 prisoners, almost all of them serving life sentences for murder, rape, deadly assault, and the like. 99 out of 100 leaders would have simply tried to stave off prison riots, ride out the final 20 years of their career, risking as little as possible in order to reach their retirement alive. Not Burl Cain. He pursued the grander vision. He wanted to make a legacy play with the last 20 years of his career, so he engineered a people development program in that prison that enabled inmates to earn their way into higher and higher levels of responsibility, trust, and freedom around the prison. During his tenure, acts of violence have dropped 85% within that prison. Now, because of his deep Christian faith and his conviction that the local church is the hope of the world, Warden Cain invited a seminary to come hold classes inside the prison so that inmates who felt called by God to start churches inside the prison could be properly trained. Today, if you can believe it, there are 271 fully trained pastors and associate pastors leading dozens of fully functioning, God-honoring Acts 2 churches inside that prison with a combined attendance of over 1,200 people. Now, Warden Cain heard that I coach and mentor pastors in various places around the world. So he contacted me and he challenged me to spend a morning mentoring the inmate pastors and the inmate associate pastors inside his prison. So a few months ago I did. It was one of the most memorable mentoring experiences of my life. And I might add that the quality of the questions and interactions with the inmate pastors were about at the same level as I enjoy with pastors, regular pastors, on the outside all over the world. After lunch, the inmate pastors invited the core members of their churches to a worship concert that our Willow team had come to lead. 800 men gathered in a chapel for a 2-hour service. During that worship time, I felt the presence and the joy of God at an intensity level that I rarely do in the churches that I travel to. At one point, I looked over my shoulder at the hands raised to heaven, tears running down the cheeks of these prisoners. They're pouring out gratitude to God for God changing their lives and so. And I just lost it. I was a basket case for the rest of that meeting. It doesn't happen often to a Dutch guy. When Warden Cain dropped me off at the airplane, I shook my head and I said, "You're doing something amazing with your life. I would not have believed I would not have believed this unless I had witnessed this with my own eyes." And the singing, I said, the sincerity of those guys, the joy was at a whole different level than what I'm accustomed to. And he smiled and he said, "Bill, forgiven much, worship much. Forgiven much, worship much." As I flew back to Chicago, I thought, hope is alive in one of the most hopeless environments in the world. Because one leader pursued a grander vision and decided to make a legacy play in a maximum security prison. He's been there 20 years. How cool is that? By the way, right now, several hundred prisoners and inmate pastors are watching this summit from our newest summit site, the Louisiana State Prison. So, way to go, guys. Way to go. I'll be back. Leaders, please listen to me. The Bible makes it crystal clear. We each only get one shot at this thing we call life. Your gravestone, like mine, will have inscribed on it a birth date and a death date. Our lives will be represented by that dash between the two dates. Now, God has given you enormous freedom to decide what to do with your dash. You can live and lead small. You can live and lead safe. You can live and lead selfishly. Or you can choose to pursue a grander vision that God will graciously reveal to you if you ask Him to. You can choose to be a hireling your whole life. You can be in it for yourself. Or you can be an owner type with a legacy mindset who leaves something beautiful behind when you're done with your dash. But this is something you must decide. For what it's worth, in the last 20 years, I've never seen a single leader drift into becoming a legacy leader. The drift in life, as you all know, is toward a lesser vision. The drift is always in the direction of self and safety and comfort. Every legacy leader I've ever met can describe where they were and what factors contributed to them finally saying, enough! Enough of me, enough of my pathetic self-absorption, enough of playing small, enough of playing safe. It's time for a grander vision. It's time for a legacy play. And every person I know who came to that point and got engaged with a grander vision, they never looked back. They would never trade their new life for their old one. Have you reached that point in your life yet? Have you really? Or do you just really talk a good game? Can I remind you one more time that this is the only dash you get to do? This is the one and only life on this earth you get to live out. Please don't go to your grave without tasting what the Bible describes as life that is truly life, a life that involves a grander vision and a legacy play, a life that leaves something beautiful behind when your dash is done. Now, speaking of leaving something beautiful behind, can I show you two pictures of stuff that my dad left behind when he suddenly died of a heart attack at 52 years of age? The first is a boat, okay? Now, you can't tell it from this picture, but that was once a very expensive, custom-built racing yacht that my dad fell in love with and purchased sight unseen in Ireland. He and a few buddies flew to Ireland, sailed it back across the Atlantic Ocean, up to the Great Lakes, and eventually to a small harbor town in Michigan, where he taught our family how to sail. That's where I learned how to sail, in the boat I learned to sail on. I grew up on that boat. He found endless pleasure on that boat. When he died, we knew as a family it would take so much money to keep and maintain it that the better choice would be to sell it. So we sold it. We lost track of it. It's had several owners since. It's now in total disrepair in the back lot of a marina where the boatyard owner told me the other day I could buy it for $1, if I would remove it from his property. From being one of my dad's prized possessions to something worth $1. Contrast that with something else my dad left behind. A large parcel of land in Upper Michigan that just before he died, he donated to our church so that maybe someday we would build a camp on it. Well, we did build a camp on it. And these days, hundreds of Willow Creek dads spend 4 days there each summer, and they spend time with their sons, and they spend time with their daughters. And Willow dads tend to be so busy, and they take the commuter train downtown, and they don't get enough time with their sons and daughters, but at Camp Paradise, they can spend 4 days, all dialed in. And we see relationships with dads and sons and dads and daughters transformed every summer. This spring, we dedicated a new worship chapel at the camp. And for generations to come, this is going to be used by God to deepen relationships with dads and sons and dads and daughters. And as we dedicated the chapel, our elders went up there and we dedicated it. I was so glad my dad made a legacy play. He had a lot of resources. Some of it went to legacy plays and others of it just frittered away. But I was really glad that my dad left something of greater value behind than just a sailboat worth $1. Now, may I ask, have you given any real thought to what your legacy will be, or what of value or beauty you will leave behind when your dash is done? Now, many of us around the country have been praying for months that thousands of you would shift into legacy gear during this very summit. We've been praying that God would speak to you about this and rock your life to decide to do something better with your dash than to leave exactly nothing behind when you're done with it. And when God whispers to you during these next couple days, I simply pray that you would pay attention and courageously do whatever He asks you to do. Okay, the final hard-fought lesson that I want to mention briefly before I wrap things up. This has to do with endurance. Endurance. James 1:12 says, "Blessed are those who persevere through trials, for afterwards they will receive the crown of life." Now, as satisfying as legacy making is, it does come with a price tag. The general rule about this is the grander the vision, the greater the price tag. The grander the vision, the greater the price tag. The single grandest vision ever pursued and achieved on planet Earth was the redemptive mission that Jesus carried out, and the price tag for that required the spilling of his own blood. Grand vision, horrendous price tag. Don't be surprised when grand visions get complicated or costly. It just comes with the territory. So accordingly, legacy leaders have to develop endurance strategies to keep them in the game over the long haul. I was reflecting the other day that in just these last 20 years that we've been meeting together at the summit, I've had to totally revamp my enduring strategies at least 3 times to offset the changing circumstances and rising demands on my life. The latest having to do with the demands and the absolute delight of having grandchildren. For half my leadership career, one of the most effective replenishment strategies for me was to go on family vacations with Lynn and my kids. After a season of high-intensity leadership, a week near or on a body of water with my wife and family would fill me with just overflowing amounts of energy. I'd be ready to go back into whatever legacy play was next. So we did that consistently, for many, many years. Then enter 2 grandchildren, Henry and Mac, and that replenishment plan stopped working almost overnight. After 7 days with these lovable little terrorists underfoot, I would come back from family vacations in desperate need of a vacation. I'd be exhausted, and so after a series of meetings with Lynn and my children, I said, I have to add some solitude breaks to my schedule. I got to do some non-family time alone if I'm going to survive this next season of leadership. And I began to realize that I needed a block of personal time where I wasn't responsible for anybody else's happiness requirements. A time where I could personally slow down, rest up, read it and reflect, and hear from God in an unrushed way. It's hard to hear God at Mach 2. But if you lower the ambient noise of your life, if you pursue solitude, you can learn how to hear the voice of God in an unrushed way. So now I have these solitude breaks built into my schedule. They've been incredibly life-giving to me. Anybody need to put a solitude break in your schedule? Think about it. Try it. Anyway, one of those breaks, solitude breaks, I did on a ship that crossed the Atlantic Ocean from New York to London. 7 days of nothing but solitude on the North Atlantic Ocean. I had my Bible, a journal, a few books on my iPad, and that's it. It just felt like heaven. But on that particular trip, something a bit unusual happened when we were in the vicinity of where the Titanic sank in 1912, killing 1,500 people. Late one morning, the captain of the ship gets on the PA system. He says that we're going to divert course and that we're going to be bringing the ship to a dead stop. Now, I know just enough about boating to know that's an unusual maneuver. It might even mean trouble of some kind. What we were to learn later is that a young Canadian woman had left Halifax on a 24-foot rowboat all alone in an attempt to row across the Atlantic all the way to France. Why, you ask? Because the boredom of living in Canada long enough drives people crazy. You Canadians thought that I was going to forget all about you. I just couldn't. Anyway, this young Canadian woman had been on the open ocean for 83 days. She'd been battered by several storms. Her rowboat was damaged. Her supplies were depleted. And she was exhausted, discouraged, and on the brink of hopelessness. She knew that without some kind of assistance, her grand adventure was going to end badly. Quick timeout. Any of you leaders ever felt that way? Exhausted, discouraged, on the brink of hopelessness. You know, I've been there. It's a terrible feeling. Anyone in that place today? Anyway, this young Canadian woman reached for her one remaining radio and said the four-letter word out loud to anyone listening: help, help. Then she gave her latitude, longitude coordinates. That's all she could do. Maybe that, and pray to God that some random fishing boat would come by someday before she died. Now imagine her surprise when out of the fog bank, the Queen Mary 2 shows up, 1,100 feet long, 230 feet high, filled to overflowing with provisions for thousands of people. We stopped for her little rowboat. The Queen Mary crew sent barrels of provision over to her. They also sent some navigational stuff to help her navigate again. When she had loaded all the supplies onto her little boat, the captain came over the intercom and invited all of his passengers and crew who were on deck watching all of this to do that very British weird thing, hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray. And we all did, so several thousand of us, hip, hip, hooray 3 times. Then we all waved and cheered her on, and all this young woman could do was wave and hold up a sign: thank you. You know, thank you, thank you. Now, later on that night, as that Canadian rower was probably drinking champagne and eating beef Wellington for the first time in a couple months, you know, she had to just shake her head and say, all I did was radio for help, and God sends the Queen Mary to help me out. I'm so glad I asked. And some of you right now are sitting in this session, and you're exhausted, and you're discouraged, and you're almost out of hope. You're trying to make a legacy play. It's just so much harder than you ever thought it would be. I get it. I've been there more often than you would imagine. Can I make a suggestion as we close? Radio for help. Call for help. Humble yourself. Admit that this rough patch is going to require outside assistance. Why not look toward heaven and say, God, please help me? Because the actual fact of the matter is we have a Queen Mary-sized God with limitless power and love at a depth no human being can fathom. We have a transcendently powerful God whose greatest joy is to make a way where there is no way for a leader who's trying to move something good ahead in this world. But you've got to ask him. You got to radio for help. The psalmist says it this way: he is near to the brokenhearted. He rescues those. He rescues those who are crushed in spirit. I love that verse. I've used it dozens of times. You might be one prayer away from a divine Queen Mary style rescue. So I would like to give all of you in that condition an opportunity to radio for help right now. Would you all please bow with me for a closing word of prayer? God, your scriptures teach us that all things are possible with your help. The Bible reminds us that you are for us, not against us. That your plans for us are good and not evil. And that you can even take our misjudgments and mistakes and orchestrate them for our good over time. Even what we're going through now, you can orchestrate for our good over time. What a God you are. God, we reach out to you now with humility. We have so much to learn. We reach out to you with repentance, those of us who are hireling types, those of us who have been in it for ourselves and reluctant to pursue a grander vision. Change our hearts, God. Reveal to us what our grander vision could be. Fill us with expectancy for what our life could be and for what you are going to do in these next few days. We pray this in Jesus' name. Everyone said, amen.